Hello and welcome to the Codename Enigma podcast. My name's Tom Christie and I'm an independent author and researcher based in Scotland. And it's my pleasure today to talk to Dr Colin M. Barron, who is the author of Codename Enigma, his second novel, which is out now. Colin, first of all I have to ask you about the title. Why have you called your book Codename Enigma?
Well, that's a very good question, Tom, because although the plot features an enigma machine, there is no codename Enigma as such. It is just that I thought that Codename Enigma was a good title. I like titles with the name Codename in them. For example, the first episode of the TV series Secret Army was called Codename Yvette. The TV series Killing Eve was based on a book called Codename Villanelle, and there was a spy movie called Codename Emerald. When I was writing the book, my working title was Desert War, but in my notebook I had 17 possible titles, including Zombie Killers, Zombie Patrol, Death to Zombies, Bomb Patrol, Surrender or Die, Walk or Die, and so on. All these titles were scrapped, but I subsequently used some of them as chapter titles. I had considered Code Enigma as a title, but I later went with Codename Enigma instead, as I thought it sounded better and also looked better visually, something I will expand on in a moment.
Now, as was the case with your first novel, Operation Archer, you've chosen a very striking cover. Could you tell me a little bit more about it?
The very dramatic cover was produced by my cousin James Culver, who is a professional graphic designer and book and DVD cover designer. I gave James a rough pencil sketch of what I had in mind, which was a long-range desert group Chevrolet truck ploughing through the desert as a nuclear bomb explodes in the background. This depicts an actual scene towards the end of the book. To go back to the title, I decided that the word codename would be on one line, with enigma on the next, set to the same width, so that enigma was taller. So you can see why the title Codename Enigma is more visually striking than Code Enigma, because the word enigma appears larger in the title than codename. If I had gone with Code Enigma, then the word code would have been larger, whereas I wanted instead to emphasise the word enigma.
So, what would you say are the origins of the story? What influences lay behind it? Can we consider it a prequel to Operation Archer?
You could consider it a prequel to Operation Archer, since it is set 2 years earlier in the same universe, with some of the characters that were in the earlier book. But the core idea for the book has been in my head for decades. Like most Doctor Who fans, I've always harboured an ambition to write a Doctor Who story, and many years ago I came up with a plot in which the TARDIS arrives at a fort in the Western Desert in 1942, where a detachment of British soldiers is fighting off repeated assaults by German troops, and then both sides come under attack by alien creatures which emerge from a giant fissure in the ground. The British and Germans are forced to forget their differences and fight together to defeat the invaders. But as the creatures have superior technology, the soldiers need the help of the Doctor, who uses brains rather than brawn to defeat the invaders. So that basic plot was used for the third quarter of the book, which becomes like a Patrick Troughton Doctor Who base under siege story. It's also a bit like the 1986 film Aliens. By contrast, the first half of the book is really like many of these World War II desert adventure films, like Tobruk, Sea of Sand, Sahara, and Ice Cold in Alex. And the last quarter of the book introduces some additional plot ideas and ties up a few loose ends.
Now, the main protagonist of your story is a Royal Army Medical Corps officer called Peter Lee. Without wishing to spoil anything of the narrative, we later learn about this character that he's based on your father. So, is there any reason why you didn't call him Peter Barron?
A lot of people have said that, and I'll give you my reasons. It's generally considered the sign of an amateur to have a character in a novel who is the same surname as the author. That's the first reason. Also, by changing his surname and making Lee a character based on my father, rather than my father himself, I was able to make a few changes. For example, in the book, Lee is a non-smoker. In reality, my father smoked until 1960. I made this change to increase the conflict between Captain Lee and SAS Major Paddy Mayne, since Mayne was a smoker and heavy drinker, both in the book and in reality. Conflict between characters is one essential element of any kind of drama. In any case, a book which simply described my father's actual experiences in North Africa wouldn't be that interesting. Not in a novel anyway. I also incorporated the idea that Lee's surname was originally Levi, but he had changed it from Levi to Lee so that the Germans wouldn't know he was Jewish if he was captured. This again is based on fact, because I have a Jewish friend who changed his surname from Levi to Lee because of anti-Semitism. At the end of the book, you do learn that Peter Lee is in reality an alternative version of my late father, Peter Barron.
Without giving too much away, what would you say is the main plot of your novel?
As I said, the first half of the book is very like all these World War II desert adventure films like Sea of Sand, Ice Cold in Alex, Tobruk and Sahara. An 18-man detachment of soldiers from the long-range desert group and SAS, which includes Captain Peter Lee, is ordered to get a German Enigma machine, a captured machine that is, out of Tobruk before the port falls to enemy forces in June 1942. Their plan is to get to an RAF forward landing ground deep in the desert, from where the machine can be flown back to Alexandria. Unfortunately, things go wrong, and the troops are forced to take refuge in a fort on the northern edge of the Katara Depression, where they come under attack from a strong German armoured force. Eventually, all the shelling causes a crack to open in the ground, and strange zombie-like creatures called Marazons appear and attack both the British and the Germans. Unbeknown to the British soldiers, the Marazons have been in suspended animation inside a huge spacecraft beneath the Katara Depression for thousands of years, controlled by a huge alien brain called the Cerebri. As if things couldn't get any worse, 1 million more Cerebri spacecraft are heading towards the Earth, each containing 50,000 Marazons. So Captain Peter Lee has to find a way to defeat the Marazons and the Cerebri, stop the alien invasion, and get the Enigma machine back to Alexandria. As to how he does all that, I'm not saying. You'll have to read the book.
Now, as you mentioned, the book features monsters called Marazons, and it's a very striking concept. So would you like to say a bit more about the characters and the idea about where they came from?
Well, the origins of the Marazons go back to a strange incident in my own life, which happened in the summer of 1968 when I was 11. One summer evening, accompanied by a friend, I visited some new houses that were being built in Greenock. In these days, no one bothered about security on building sites, and my friend got into one of the half-built houses and went down through a hatch and under the floorboards. A few minutes later, he emerged looking distraught and announced that he'd been captured by alien creatures wearing metal suits, but had broken free. Obviously he was spinning a yarn, but I went along with it. I kind of wanted to believe, as you do at that age, and I started having dreams about these creatures, which I learned were called Marazons. Subsequently, I dreamed that there was a subspecies called Saracens, which could kill using electric shocks. So in 2019, when I was devising the monsters for Codename Enigma, I remembered that instant and drew in these experiences. I simplified things by having just one species, the Marazons, but gave it the ability to deliver electric shocks. I also introduced the concept that they were a kind of zombie, which was animated by electricity. So the Marazons are really dead bodies which have been reanimated with electricity and then given body armour to protect them from gunfire. Another change I made was I gave the Marazons transparent visors instead of a metal mask, so that you could see the face of a corpse behind it, as I thought this would look more frightening. I also introduced the idea that the cerebri has technology which can reverse the necrosis of tissue. One objection I've always had to zombie movies is that their bodies must be rotting. So how can their muscles contract? And how do their intestines digest food? So I addressed this issue with the cerebri's necrosis reversing technology. I was also keen that the Marazons should be hard to kill but not impossible to kill. I don't like the cliche in science fiction movies that alien monsters are always resistant to bullets. The Marazons are not affected by small arms fire, but can be killed with heavier weapons. The problem is really the numbers of them. It's rather like the film Aliens, in which the colonial marines have weapons that can kill the aliens, but the problem is the sheer numbers of them. Initially, the British soldiers only have to face a small number of Marazons, but more are being brought out of hibernation, and 1 million cerebri spacecraft are heading towards the Earth, each containing 50,000 Marazons.
Now, from reading your book, and again wishing to avoid spoilers, I notice that the Marazons don't speak. Can you say a bit more about why that is the case?
It's because I think monsters are more frightening and eerie when they don't speak. Boris Karloff only made noises in the original Frankenstein film. In the second film, The Bride of Frankenstein, he did have a few lines of dialogue, and Karloff himself felt this made the monster less scary.
I know from all your previous books that you consider structure to be a very important issue. Can you tell me a bit more about the structure of Codename Enigma?
After I wrote Operation Archer, I spent a few months reading a lot of articles and viewing many YouTube videos on the subject of writing novels. I found a lot of the advice was confusing and contradictory, but one thing I did like was a schema for writing novels, which is often referred to as the hero's journey, or alternatively, the hero with 1,000 faces. And this comes from the work of author Joseph Campbell and is effectively a template for writing any kind of adventure story. Campbell's theory is that there is really only one story, and all the great novels and screenplays follow this basic template. So to give just 3 examples, the original 1977 Star Wars, The Wizard of Oz and Die Hard use this same formula. It's very complicated, so I'll just describe the main points as they apply to Codename Enigma. The first stage in Campbell's template is the ordinary world. One must first see the hero in their ordinary world. Codename Enigma originally opened with Captain Lee on the deck of a British destroyer, HMS Kiwi, heading towards Tobruk. But I felt this wasn't ordinary enough. So after the book was completed, I grafted on a 550-word prologue in which Lee is working as a GP in Wales in early 1942, bored out his box, treating mundane complaints instead of contributing to the war effort. He yearns for action. Then he hears the sound of a letter being pushed through his letterbox. It's his call-up papers. An extraordinary adventure is about to begin. The next step in Campbell's template is the call to adventure, followed by an initial refusal of the call. And this is a very important step, and is the reason why in action stories the hero often initially refuses to go on the mission or expresses doubts. So in the film The Guns of Navarone, Captain Mallory initially turns down the mission, saying that it would be impossible to scale the steep cliffs on the island of Navarone. He has to be persuaded to take part. In 633 Squadron, Wing Commander Grant expresses great doubts about the feasibility of the mission to bomb the German rocket fuel factory. In Rambo 2, John Rambo is visited in prison by his mentor Colonel Troutman, and initially refuses to go on the mission to rescue American POWs. And in Aliens, Ripley initially refuses to go on the Colonial Marines mission to kill the aliens. The next step in Campbell's template is crossing the threshold, that is setting out on the mission and passing from the ordinary world to the special world. Then allies and villains appear, and then the hero meets his mentor. In Lee's case it is Major Paddy Mayne, the great SAS hero. Lee and Mayne are in many ways diametrically opposite in character, looks, and in likes and dislikes. Mayne is a 17-stone former rugby player who's very fit, very physical, and very volatile. He likes to shoot first and ask questions later, and is good with his fists. On one raid in an enemy airfield, Mayne ran out of bombs, so he disabled several enemy planes by ripping out their instrument panels with his bare hands. Lee, by comparison, is a 5'8" intellectual who doesn't smoke and avoids alcohol. But they learn from each other as the book progresses and become more like one another. Lee admires Mayne's combat skills and assertiveness, while Mayne respects Lee's tremendous knowledge of science and medicine. Then, to go back to Joseph Campbell's template, the hero faces a series of tests or battles, and there's a final test, a final confrontation in which all seems lost, and you cannot see how the hero can possibly survive and triumph over adversity. But he does. In the final step of Campbell's template, the hero returns to his ordinary world with a magic elixir, in this case the Enigma machine. But he's changed by his experiences, and it affects him for the rest of his life. So that is how I applied Campbell's template to the writing of Codename Enigma. Another writing trick I used was the well-known Rule of 3, which states, for example, that the hero should only manage to pull an important lever at the third attempt. I used this trick a few times in the book. Captain Lee goes into the abyss to confront the Cerebri and the Marazons 3 times during the course of the book, and each LRDG truck contains 3 soldiers, and only 3 people survive the mission. So the number 3 crops up a few times in the book.
The novel is set mainly in June 1942, and I know that, as always, you took great trouble to get all of the historical details of the period right. Why was the summer of 1942 such an important time for the Allies?
The summer of 1942 was a crucial time for the Allies, particularly Britain, because the British Eighth Army had endured a series of disasters and defeats, with the most recent being the fall of Tobruk. The Japanese had captured Singapore in February, and there was a real possibility that Churchill could be sacked as Prime Minister over his handling of the war. Part of the reason for all the defeats in North Africa was that there was an intelligence leak. Reports written by Colonel Bonner Fellers, the US military attaché in Egypt, were being read by the Germans as they'd broken the diplomatic code. The leak was finally discovered by the code breakers at Bletchley Park in June 1942, and this was one of the reasons why Allied fortunes started to change by the end of that summer. But until that point, there was a real possibility that the British could be kicked out of Africa by Rommel's forces.
In your previous novel, Operation Archer, a number of historical figures appear in the book, including Churchill, Hitler, and future Doctor Who actor Patrick Troughton. Codename Enigma features a few appearances by James Bond creator Ian Fleming. Would you like to say a little bit more about why Fleming appears in the book?
During the Second World War, Ian Fleming worked in the Department of Naval Intelligence at Admiralty Arch in Whitehall. He started off as a lieutenant in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve and ended the war as a commander, just like his fictional creation, James Bond. It is well known that Fleming based many of the Bond stories on his own wartime experiences and events he had heard about. For example, many of the plot points in the book and film Thunderball were inspired by the real-life exploits of the Royal Navy frogman Buster Crabbe. Other aspects of Bond's personality and his likes and dislikes came from Fleming himself. For example, both Bond and Fleming had a great love of eggs, and there is a scene in my book towards the end where Fleming and Churchill meet for breakfast and feast on scrambled eggs and toast, washed down with real coffee made in an American Chemex.
One of the most important characters in Codename Enigma is actually a British Valentine Tank, which plays a key part in the action. Would you like to say a little bit more about the inclusion of the tank?
One of the many inspirations for the book was the 1943 Humphrey Bogart movie Sahara, in which the crew of an American M3 Lee tank helped to defend a fort from attacking German forces. However, I decided to have a British rather than American tank in these scenes, and I chose the Valentine Tank, which was one of the lesser known British armoured vehicles. Weighing in at just 17 tons, the Valentine would be classed as a light tank by modern standards, but it bore the brunt of the fighting in North Africa between 1941 and 1943 before being eclipsed by the American-made Sherman tank. Originally equipped with a puny 2-pounder gun, the Valentine was upgunned to a 6-pounder, and then by 1943 to a 75mm gun, giving it equal firepower to the Sherman. In my book, the tank is a so-called Super Valentine, a fictitious variant with a 75mm gun, thicker armour, and engine upgrades, which all help it to defeat German Panzer IVs. Interestingly, Ian Fleming's father was called Valentine Fleming, which is another connection with the name.
And in one final point, I know that both your mother and father sadly passed away many years ago. What do you think they would make of the book if they could read it now?
I think they would be amused and flattered by it, especially as their photos appear in the book towards the end. My mother had a similar sense of the absurd to me. She used to enjoy watching Monty Python's Flying Circus, whereas my father couldn't understand it. I like to think that wherever my mother and father are now, they have read the book, approved it, and maybe even helped me to write it.
Well, Colin, thank you very much for having joined us today. It's been a pleasure to talk to you about your book. If you happen to enjoy historical drama, wartime thrillers, science fiction, fantasy, or just a really entertaining read, then I think you'll find that Codename Enigma is very much a book that you will enjoy. It's available to buy now from all good independent booksellers and online retailers worldwide. Colin, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tom.
And thanks for listening.